Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I'm John Hilbolt, Director of Lectures and Seminars, and it's my privilege to welcome everyone here to our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website, those who will join us in the future on C-SPAN Book TV. And we would remind everyone here in-house, if you'll be so kind, thank you, Jim, to check that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. It's always appreciated. And one of these times, mine is going to ring as I say that. Thank you, ma'am. Do you wish to turn up the mic a little, Adam? Our internet viewers are also welcome to send questions or comments via the internet, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we will post the program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. My reminder is we have copies of Josh's book available in the foyer for purchase, and he will be signing them here afterwards if you would like to continue the conversation from today's program. Hosting our program and introducing our guest is James Phillips, Senior Research Fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy. Mr. Phillips is a veteran of foreign policy studies and has written widely on Middle Eastern affairs and international terrorism since 1978. He is a former research fellow at the Congressional Research Service of the Library of Congress and a former joint doctoral research fellow at the East-West Center. Since 9/11, he has written extensively on the global war on terrorism and its implications for U.S. policy in the Middle East. He has also testified before Congress on Middle Eastern security issues, including the Arab-Israeli conflict, Iran nuclear issues, and Middle Eastern terrorism. Please join me in welcoming Jim Phillips. Jim?
Thank you, John. In recent days, Israel has been attacked and has been compelled to take action to defend itself from attacks from Gaza. This is the third time in 6 years. Once again, voices have been raised criticizing these military operations and demonizing Israel for acts of self-defense that will be no-brainers for just about any other country in the world. This is a sad and tragic time, especially for the more than 1.7 million Palestinians who essentially have been taken hostage by Hamas in its efforts to advance its radical agenda. We're fortunate to have with us today Joshua Moravchik, whose book, Making David into Goliath, How the World Turned Against Israel, seems particularly relevant to current events. Dr. Moravchik has written hundreds of articles in major U.S. newspapers and intellectual journals on a wide variety of foreign policy, political, and ideological topics. He's the author of 9 previous books, including Heaven on Earth, The Rise and Fall of Socialism, Exporting Democracy, Fulfilling America's Destiny, and Trailblazers of the Arab Spring, Voices of Democracy in the Middle East. He's currently a fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. For many years, he was at the American Enterprise Institute. From 2011 to 2013, he was also a fellow at the George W. Bush Institute. He was a fellow in residence at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and before that, back in the 1970s, he was a congressional aide to Representative James O'Hara and to Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Joshua?
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for coming here to hear what I have to say. I'm grateful for that. And it is certainly a striking coincidence that a process that we've watched repeat itself many times over the past decade and a half is now taking place once again, in which Israel is attacked, it strikes back in self-defense, and then it receives widespread criticism around the world and from various quarters in the United States and in the media. And this was a subject that I tackled in this book. Why does it work this way? And the idea for the book came to me about 4 or 5 years ago, one morning when I read in the paper or on the internet about a story in a newspaper in Sweden. It was a story that ran in the Swedish daily Aftonbladet, which is the widest circulation daily in Sweden. And the story reported that Israelis were now slaughtering Palestinians randomly in order to harvest their body organs for sale. The story, need I say, had no basis whatsoever. It was built around the case of a single deceased Palestinian who had a scar on his body because he had been autopsied. But when reporters for other publications followed up the Aftonbladet story and went to this man's family, they denied having ever made such an accusation to Aftonbladet. In other words, the Swedish reporter had essentially made this up out of whole cloth. The Swedish ambassador to Israel apologized for the story, at which point she was reprimanded and forced by the Swedish Foreign Ministry to withdraw her apology on the grounds that it was an infringement on press freedom. Well, when I read about this that morning 4 or 5 years ago, I thought, how can this be? This is so crazy. How did we come to this? I can understand that people feel critical of Israel at one moment or another, disagree with Israeli policies. Sure, fair game. Who doesn't? I do sometimes. But to have an image of Israel in which you could imagine and put in print writers and editors in a major Western daily newspaper that Israelis were randomly slaughtering Palestinians to harvest their organs. How did we come to a point where people had an image of Israel that would allow them to think and write and publish such things? And it was also startling to me because I'm old enough to remember 40 years earlier, the time of the Six-Day War, the time when the support for and sympathy for Israel around the world was very, very substantial. Public opinion polls showed that in the United States, perhaps half people did not have an opinion or didn't care or didn't know about it, but of the half who did, the support for Israel versus support for the Arabs was quite overwhelming. I don't remember exactly, it's about 8-1, something like that. But what is interesting is that similar polls were taken in Britain and France, and the ratio of support for Israel was even more one-sided than it was in the United States. In the United States, there's still a great deal of support for Israel, but around the world, it's completely evaporated. And so I set out to write this book to ask myself the question, what it was that had brought about this dramatic change. I can't think of any case in history in which a country which had not undergone a revolution and a complete change of its political regime was the subject of such a complete reversal in the way the outside world regarded that country. And as I studied it, I thought of or learned about certain things. Well, first, the obvious things. Israel's triumph in the 1967 war changed many things. For one thing, Israel never again was to seem as threatened as it did on the eve of that war when the Arab armies were mobilized on its borders and the Arab rulers were declaring quite plainly their intention to eliminate Israel once and for all. And Israel, after that, was to seem not so vulnerable and very strong. But there were also, I think, more subtle processes that took place. One was the death of pan-Arabism. To that moment, the leading figure in the Arab world was President Nasser of Egypt. And the leading idea was the idea that he was the great exponent of, and that was pan-Arabism. If you look back, the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, was founded in 1964 at the behest of Nasser. And it was not the Palestinian Liberation Organization, it was the Palestine Liberation Organization, because it was not formed with any thought of creating an independent Palestine. The point was simply to liberate Palestine from the Jews so that it could become part of this omnibus Arab state that Nasser espoused. If you look at the Palestinian National Charter, which was adopted in 1964, it makes no mention of having a Palestinian state or of sovereignty for the Palestinians. It is all about the Palestinians as part of the Arab nation. But the defeat of the Arabs in 1967 was so devastating and so humiliating that it destroyed Nasser's prestige. And with this destruction of Nasser's prestige, it also destroyed the idea of pan-Arabism. And that, in turn, cleared the field for the emergence in the next years of Palestinian nationalism. And Palestinian nationalism had been advocated by a few Palestinians, among them Yasser Arafat and some of his friends who were mostly working in Kuwait, and that was their own headquarters, and they had formed Fatah. And over the years after 1967, they moved into the PLO and took it over. And we saw the emergence of Palestinian nationalism and the Palestinian claim to sovereignty and independence as an issue in the conflict for the first time. And so instead of the conflict having an image of the large or massive Arabs against little Israel, it became now little but strong Israel against tiny and weak Palestine. And instead of the issue being Israel, because Israel also now was, at the end of '67 war, in occupation of territories where several million Palestinian Arabs lived, instead of it being a question that people who were trying to deny the Jews a state of their own, it now became a question of the Jews or the Israelis trying to deny another people a state of their own, that is, the Palestinians. So this gave the whole conflict a different look. But this is still not a sufficient explanation of the hostility that is arrayed against Israel today. Because it may be that the world came to care about occupation or about Palestinian national aspirations, but this in itself requires explanation, because no one cares about other occupations. Who gets exercised about the occupation of Tibet? It's far more long-standing and brutal than the occupation of the Palestinians. And in terms of the national aspirations of the Palestinians, who champions the national aspirations of the Kurds, whose national aspirations are more powerfully rooted and justifiable in every dimension than those of the Palestinians? That is, the Kurds are a much larger people. There are about 5 or 6 times as many Kurds as Palestinians. They have their own culture, language, history. They have no other country. They have no country of their own. But no one, sadly, no one gives a fig for the denied national aspirations of the Kurds. So this, the question of national aspirations and occupation really can't begin to explain the international mood or attitudes that we see today. This, by the way, and it's manifested in other inconsistencies than this broad one. In fact, inconsistency is rife in the demonization of Israel that we see around us so much. For example, the British teacher unions have voted for academic boycotts of Israeli universities. But these same teacher unions have never voted for or proposed, to my knowledge, even discussed or debated, academic boycotts of universities and countries in which there is A, no academic freedom, and B, no unions of teachers or anyone else. But that passes unnoticed. We've seen recently that the Presbyterian Church has voted to divest holdings from companies that are involved with Israel. But has it ever voted to divest from companies that are involved with countries which deny religious freedom and persecute Christians? So there's a woeful inconsistency. And there also, what goes, I think, hand in hand with this, there seems to be actually no serious interest in the facts. That is, this case is decided before the facts. It struck me when the Goldstone report was issued about the last significant war in Gaza. And the Goldstone report was issued, and the very next morning, Carl Bildt, who was the foreign minister of Sweden, and at that moment Sweden held the chairmanship or the presidency of the EU. So he was speaking on behalf of the whole EU. The very next morning, on behalf of the EU, Carl Bildt endorsed the Goldstone report. Now, have you ever seen it? The Goldstone report is 500 pages long of very small type. Carl Bildt had not read the Goldstone report between the day before when it was issued and the morning that he endorsed it in the name of all of Europe. He hadn't read it. He hadn't read a summary of it. He wasn't going to read it. He didn't care what was in the report. The point was that it condemned Israel, and therefore automatically it had to be embraced and endorsed. It must be right. Because Israel is somehow inherently wrong. Israel is by definition the bad guy, and never mind with the facts. And the question is, how did we get to that situation? And I think this is the result of two different kinds of forces that have been at work over these 40 years. On the one hand, material pressures that were brought to bear, and on the other hand, intellectual changes that have altered this, the equation with regard to the Middle East conflict. By material pressures, I mean, first of all, the use of terrorism, which was carried out widely on European soil in terms of bombings and airplane hijackings through the 1970s, and did in fact terrorize the Europeans until they came into a mode of complete appeasement of the terrorists. There was a count made, some 204 perpetrators of hijackings and bombings who lived through the event, were captured and detained and were in European prisons. And of them, 201 were more or less instantaneously released for fear that their comrades would come and do another hijacking and make life uncomfortable. It was not only the Europeans, by the way. Also the moderate Arabs were terrorized. And so you can look in the memoirs of Abu Iyad, who was Arafat's main deputy, and he, with a French author, wrote memoirs that are available in English. And in his memoirs, he boasts about the Arab Summit meeting in 1974 in Rabat, Morocco, which declared the PLO to be the sole legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people. And in his memoir, Abu Iyad said, "We secured this vote because we created a climate of terror," his words, around the meeting. And so the moderate Arab leaders were afraid to go against them. On top of the use of intimidation through terrorism came the oil embargo that was implemented at the time of the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And that really, these two things combined really brought Europe and Japan to their knees. And European leaders spoke openly of the need to change their orientation on the Middle East conflict because of their dependence on Arab oil. And the next year, when the boycott over, Secretary of State Kissinger took in mind the idea that the Western countries would have to find some mechanisms to free themselves from the threat of future oil embargoes, to find some countervailing pressure that they could bring to bear. And so he made a tour of European capitals in 1974 to try to rally the Europeans to join us in some kind of measures to raise this cloud from over us. And he wrote in his memoirs of his terrible frustration, and I quote, "Every minister I consulted with was still terrified of possible confrontation with the oil producers," close quote. And so this was a complete failure because the European ministers preferred to appease rather than to resist. And the third part of what I lumped together as the material pressures were brought to bear is the sheer weight of numbers. For every Jew in the world, there are 100 Muslims. There's one Israel. There are 22 member states of the Arab League, 57 member states of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And it is a fact of life or of human nature that most people, seeing a conflict between the many and the few, find it more comfortable to take sides with the many. Only the very brave will join with the few. And there's also a practical consequence of this overwhelming weight of numbers, which of course translates into diplomatic pressure, it translates into economic power. It also has enabled the Arabs to take over the UN. So at the UN, you have the Security Council, where the United States has a veto and is not really a problem. But every other UN body is by majority rule, and those are all dominated by the so-called non-aligned movement, whose 120 members make up about 2/3 of the UN, and about half of the non-aligned movement is made up of the Islamic countries, the members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and their core are the 22 member states of the Arab League. And so that makes a kind of telescoping leverage by which the Arabs have had their way, and not only had their way, but turned the UN into a platform and an instrument for the campaign against Israel. It's astonishing, but the General Assembly, which has an unlimited writ, it can take up any issue, any problem in the world that the members choose, spends an immense proportion of its time every year passing resolution after resolution denouncing Israel. It very rarely passes any resolutions criticizing any other state. It does occasionally, but of all the resolutions passed by the General Assembly, 3/4 that mention that all the resolutions that mention a particular country in some critical vein, 3/4 have been devoted to the denigration of Israel, 1/4 to any misdeeds by any of the other 194 countries in the world. And on top of this endless churning out of resolutions against Israel, the UN has created 3 special bodies, two commissions and 1 bureau, which has a multi-million-dollar budget and a large staff, that are devoted entirely to propagating the Palestinian cause and denigrating Israel. So these together, the weight of numbers, oil, terror, are the material pressures that were brought to bear to change world opinion on this conflict. But then an equally important part of this change was a transformation that happened on the intellectual level. This was not engineered by the Arabs or the Palestinians, but they played a part in it, and they've been able to take advantage of it to turn around how the world treats this conflict. And that is, this intellectual transformation takes the form of a change in paradigm in the main ideas of leftism or progressivism. For about a century, the core idea of leftist progressive thought was class struggle, the poor against the rich, the workers against the capitalists. And this class struggle was portrayed not just as a matter of justice, of things being equaled out, but it was portrayed as a redemptive historic struggle that would make the whole world a better and happier place. Sometime in the latter part of the 20th century, after about 100 years, this paradigm, this image of how the world was going to be made right, began to lose its force. And it came to be replaced by another kind of morality play of struggle, and this was national and ethnic struggle that grew out of the movements against colonialism. But that didn't end with colonialism. Colonialism died, but anti-colonialism did not. It became anti-neo-colonialism and then anti-post-colonialism. And in this view, instead of the class struggle, we got, instead of workers against capitalists, we got the rest against the West. And it came also to be overlaid with the images of the heroic civil rights struggle that went on in the United States, the most watched country in the world. And so all of this came to be rolled together into one ball of wax that also, in addition to being called the rest against the West, is often called the people of color against the white man. And this, too, is not just a matter of righting a wrong or justice, but came to be seen as a redemptive struggle that would make the whole world a better and happier place. As I said, this was not something that was, this intellectual transition was not purposefully invented by advocates of the Arab side or by Israel's enemies, but they were able to take advantage of it, and someone who came to be the leading symbol of this new paradigm was, in fact, the most prominent Palestinian American I think that there's ever been, and that was Edward Said of Columbia University, whose work, in particular whose book Orientalism, became immensely influential. The newspaper The Guardian wrote that Said was the most influential single intellectual of our time. There was a web search done of syllabi. Most syllabi these days, not when I went to college, but most syllabi these days are online, and so you can search them broadly. Someone did a search and found that there are 900 courses in American universities in which Said's books are assigned. There are courses at universities like Georgetown and UCLA entirely devoted to the thought of Edward Said, and there's even a Cambridge introduction to the thought of Edward Said. Edward Said's thought, I can tell you in a nutshell, amounts to a complete intellectual fraud. It's not just something I disagree with. It is something that has no legitimate intellectual standing whatsoever if the world were to look at it with clear eyes. Why do I say something that drastic? Said's thought, it boiled down to the idea that you can see is absurd and self-contradictory, the idea that all white people are inherently racist. He didn't say exactly those words, but he said the same thing. I give you a quote. He said, every European, when he said Europeans elsewhere in his book, he also said that what he said about Europeans also applied to Americans. Every European, in what he could say about the Orient, was a racist, an imperialist, and almost totally ethnocentric. And Said went about in his most important book proving this broad thesis by allegedly examining the work of scholarly Orientalists, meaning essentially people who studied the Muslim world. And he purported to show that they were all racists and imperialists. But what he really did was just to go out in the universe of the writings of 19th century European intellectuals and look for racist quotes. And then he strung them together in his book and said, here's a quote and here's a quote, and these people were all Orientalists. The problem was that some of the people Said quoted were not Orientalists at all. He first found the racist quote, and then he gave them a new label purporting that they had studied what they hadn't studied. Some of them were unimportant. And on there were, you could call them Orientalists, but they had little standing in the field. Some of them had the one quote, but then contrary quotes that he left out. But he left out entirely people who were genuine giants in the field of Oriental studies, whose writing clearly went in the opposite direction of what Said was purporting to prove about the racist imperialist attitudes of Westerners who studied the Orient. So arguably the most important, or one of the most important of these figures, was a Hungarian Jew named Ignaz Goldziher, who wrote in the late 1800s, and who is regarded by many as having been really the granddaddy of Muslim and Arab studies in the West. And Goldziher, who is left out of Said's study, lived for years in the Arab countries. And of course, like all people who study another region of the world, he loved it. That is what normally happens if you are in academia, people who specialize in Latin American studies, Chinese studies, whatever it may be. Their normal mindset is to form a great affection for the place and the people you study, and that was true, contrary to Said, for Orientalists too. And Goldziher exemplified it, and so Goldziher wrote, and this capsulizes his attitude. Remember, he was a Jew, and he wrote, "I discovered that Islam was the only religion which can satisfy philosophic minds. My ideal was to elevate Judaism to a similar rational level." That's the real Orientalist, as opposed to Said's stick figures, which you or your children have been assigned to read at American universities. And so Said kind of is emblematic of this whole intellectual process that I've discussed. And despite this kind of fraud, his writing was so in tune with the zeitgeist that he became this most celebrated and revered and assigned figure as the embodiment of this new intellectual paradigm I've described. What he did was he made the people of color the new chosen people, the new people whose liberation would redeem mankind. He made the Oriental into the ultimate example of the people of color, the Muslims into the representative Orientals, and the Arabs into the central or core Muslims, and finally the Palestinians into the ultimate quintessential Arabs. And by this chain of reasoning, abracadabra, Israel was transformed from, in it, because it was in conflict with the Palestinians, it was transformed from being seen as a redemptive refuge of a people from thousands of years of persecution to the very embodiment of white supremacy and oppression. And I think in that transformation lies the explanation for the question I asked myself that morning when I read about the often blotted story of how could people possibly believe such a thing. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be happy to take questions or comments.
Thank you, Joshua. I'd like to ask the first question, then after I do, I'll throw it up to the audience, and I ask you to ask real questions, pretty concise, so that everybody gets a chance, and also to identify yourself. And we'll get some microphones around. Wait till the microphone comes to you. But as for my question, Joshua, we conservatives like to say that ideas have consequences. As Richard Weaver wrote, and it strikes me that one of the ideas that has had increasing consequences throughout the Middle East is this paradigm shift, as you mentioned, between pan-Arab nationalism, secular, often secular socialist nationalism, and a new revolutionary Islamist extremist revolutionary doctrine, and as represented, I think, by Hamas, which is an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is putting into effect the ideas of a former Muslim Brotherhood theorist, Sayyid Qutb, who borrowed many ideas of a vanguard party and ceaseless struggle from communist thought, and applied these in an Islamist context. And that along with the breakdown of the Oslo peace process, has made it even harder to imagine a compromise on a national basis between Israel and Palestine if the conflict is increasingly defined in religious terms and the Hamas or whatever collection of leaders on the other side sees themselves as acting to advance their concept of God's interests, then compromise itself becomes blasphemy, and it becomes increasingly hard to see any kind of negotiated settlement to this thing. And that, taken with some of the war crimes that have been perpetuated as Hamas, has taken Palestinians hostage and hides among civilians to launch rockets at civilians, in the long term could discredit that cause in the eyes of many non-Muslims. So do you see any impact on Israel's image coming out of the succession of what looks to outsiders as self-defeating armed attempts to kill civilians with very little gain to the average Palestinian in the street? Do you think over time that'll make Westerners, particularly Europeans, look differently at Israel?
Thank you. It's a deep question, Jim, but I always hate questions where I have to try to speculate about the future. I'd much rather speculate about the past. I think that the Islamists have gained a lot of steam, and since I think it was the Iranian Revolution that really, even though it was Shiite and most Muslims are Sunnis, and there's a lot of tension between them, but I think it was the Iranian Revolution, the creation of the first Islamic republic, that really gave a tremendous shot in the arm to Islamism. And over these decades, the last 35 years, we've seen that that's been on the rise, but it is also evoking some backlash, as you're suggesting, and some horror at the things they're doing, and one hopes that will spread to the West. The interesting thing is that reaction against Islamism, I think, is to this point most evident, or at this moment in this current Gaza crisis, it's most evident in the Arab world, where I think a lot of people are quite unhappy with the Islamists. I mean, they're by far the largest majority of their victims, people who have died at their hands, have not been Jews or Christians, but have been Muslims. And think what you will about the takeover by General Sisi in Egypt, but before the army moved, there were millions of Egyptians who took to the streets against the Muslim Brotherhood rule. So, and I think in this current war in Gaza, where we are getting not only, they used to talk about TV wars, but of course that's been as something new, but but that's already something old, because this is an internet, Twitter, social media war, and we are getting all these terrible images of innocent civilians in Gaza who are getting killed and bombed out of their homes, and children among the victims, and yet there really hasn't been the kind of rage in the Arab world against Israel that we've seen at other moments when there have been these conflicts. Of course, most people in the Arab world will feel an identity with the Arab side of the fight, but there hasn't been that fury that we've seen on other occasions. So, and I attribute that to the fact that a lot of people in the Arab world are getting sick of the Islamists. And I think they do understand that Hamas started this round of fighting. Whether Westerners will catch up with the Arabs on this score, I think remains an unknown.
Okay, let me just open it up to questions at this point. This man right here, and then the two men behind him.
Greetings, my name is Jeffrey Damien Capella. I'm a U.S. Army veteran of Ground Zero, a national security consultant, president and founder of the Soldiers and Statesmen Foundation, a nonprofit for my fellow soldiers, an ardent Republican and unapologetic neoconservative. I wanted to thank the speaker for extending us the courtesy of their time and diligence surrounding this issue. To that end, I wanted to revisit a core tenet that seems in part defines the thematic elements of the lecture. I'm, of course, talking about the kind of intertemporal scope of your research, which seems to look at the impact of strategic information and influence operations implemented by U.S. and Israeli adversaries, the goals of which would be to attempt, unfairly so, to delegitimize Israel and delink Israel from its allies. I wanted to know if in your research you came across any evidence that illustrates empirically the organizational operational ties between assets of influence by Soviet supporters during the Cold War and witting or unwitting assets of contemporary U.S. and Israeli adversaries.
I don't know that I have found the goods you're looking for, the kind of hard evidence of institutions or individuals who did X, Y, or Z. But the broader picture, you don't need to have special information or intelligence to know, which is that the Soviet Union is gone now, but for at least its last 20 years of life, it worked very much in this field of trying to transform world sentiment against Israel. And that was because there's one effect of the 1967 war that I left out of my presentation, just in order to keep it short, although it was probably too long anyway, but to keep it from getting longer. And that was one other interesting effect was that Israel's lightning victory in 1967 was a tremendous humiliation to the Soviet Union as well as to Nasser, because the Soviets had really pushed that war. They had agitated the Egyptians and the Syrians. The Arab armies were armed with Soviet weapons, and and it was seen as, to some degree, a Cold War proxy war. One side allied with the West, and the other side allied with the Soviet camp, and therefore it was a tremendous humiliation to the Soviets. It showed their side was losing. Their weapons weren't as good as Western weapons, And it had a very powerful effect inside the Soviet Empire. So, for one thing, it ignited the consciences of Jews within the Soviet Union itself, who numbered several million, who had not had any kind of freedom of religious or other cultural activities. So many of them just had an awareness of a heritage that they were Jews, but hadn't lived any kind of Jewish life, either religiously or culturally. But they felt this identity, and they felt it 100 times more strongly when little Israel defeated these big Soviet client states. And so we got the movement within the USSR of Soviet Jews for the right to emigrate. It was the first time in the history of communism that there was some kind of semi-mass movement for rights and against the regime. Until then, there'd only been an individual dissident here or there. So that was momentous. And it also had an effect in the empire, that is, in the so-called satellite countries, where people who were not Jews but who were under the Soviet boot and felt kind of hopeless about it suddenly had hope. If Israel could defeat the Soviet clients in the Middle East, well, this monolith that we're up against is not invulnerable and not invincible. And so it did have it sent a shudder through Soviet leaders. And the result of that was that they mobilized and didn't stop until they were gone, a campaign of denigration of Israel and Zionism. They played a big role in the UN in the propounding the Zionism is racism resolution. And so there was certainly a very powerful connection, and there was also a connection, and this you may think of as more nuts and bolts, that is in these early years after Fatah moved into the PLO, took over, and the Palestinian cause was kind of consecrated, then they quite consciously apprenticed themselves to the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong and to other communist revolutionary forces around the world, who said, we can show you how to defeat a militarily superior enemy, and you don't do it on the battlefield, you do it through politics and information or disinformation. And that was an enormous transformation, because until that point in the Arab world, the Arabs had been allied with the Axis in World War II. There were German Nazi escaped criminals in Egypt churning out propaganda, and that's where some of the kill the Jews, drive the Jews into the sea stuff came from. Some of it was homegrown, but some of it was helped and encouraged by these former Nazis. And after '67, the Arabs figured out this really isn't working, and so the Arab cause was repositioned from right to left, so all at once. So that's not exactly the detail you're looking for, but that's as much as I can add to this subject.
This man right here.
Excellent presentation, Josh, as always. Given the really false and pernicious falsehoods, images that have been targeted at Israel that you describe in your book, what is it that Israel and its supporters in the West do to counter them?
Well, I wrote a book. I think that Israel itself has not been great at PR, or what they call information, hasbara, information, or telling their story. And I don't know why, because they're so good at so many things, but they've been pretty poor at this. And I have also the sense that they don't try very hard. I think there's a certain cynicism in Israel that the world's against us anyway, so why bother? I know sometimes just in my role as a researcher, trying to get information from Israeli sources that will counteract some anti-Israel story that's out there that I suspect is false, and I can never get it. So I think there's a problem on the Israeli side, and on the on this side, on the American or Western side, for people who support Israel and want to see it survive and flourish, I think, for one thing, we have to not be intimidated. And increasingly, there's actually physical intimidation going on university campuses. It's been a common thing for a few years. Now we've seen a little bit of it in the streets in Boston, Los Angeles in these last weeks, and of course even more in Paris and European places. And it's important not to be intimidated, but it's also important not to be intimidated intellectually. And that is, if I'm right in my analysis that a part of what Israel's up against is that it's up against sort of the dominant progressive interpretation of the current stage of world history, which is this stage of the struggle of the rest against the West, then it is intellectually intimidating to go against it, because you don't want to be a Neanderthal, you don't want to be a racist, you don't want to be someone who is unsympathetic to the claims of people who have been oppressed or discriminated against in the past. And you shouldn't be unsympathetic to those claims, but you should only be sympathetic to them to the extent that they're just and that they don't entail some new injustice. And people just have to have the intellectual courage to stand up and argue for what they feel is right, even if it goes against the zeitgeist and even if it goes against what seems to be the proper way of thinking by, all upright moral people.
Yes, this woman in the back here.
Hi, I'm Deborah Weiss from Front Page Magazine. I appreciate you coming today and enjoyed your presentation. But I couldn't help but notice that you omitted any mention of the anti-Semitism that has plagued the Jews throughout the centuries and that they've been scapegoated throughout all of history. Certainly, Hamas's charter, which says expressly that it wants to eliminate the Jews, not by diplomatic means, but by violence, and the unholy alliance between leftists and Islamists. Also, I might as well add, also the inherent anti-Semitism as well as anti-Christian phobia and all of that in some interpretations of Islam, and certainly in Hamas's.
I didn't talk about anti-Semitism, and I don't talk about it except perhaps a glancing way in the book, because while I am sure it's a factor in hostility to Israel, the question that I was trying to answer is what has changed so dramatically over 40 years. And it can't be that there was no anti-Semitism or very little anti-Semitism in the world 40 years ago. Anti-Semitism is there today, but it was there then, and it's been there for centuries and millennia. And so it's kind of a given, but however much anti-Semitism there is in the world, we had an era, which really was from the late 40s through the late 60s, and I took the Six-Day War as the epitome of that, but you can think when there wasn't a war, but just in popular culture, the novel Exodus, which was published in the 1950s, was the best-selling novel in the United States since Gone with the Wind. And then it went on to be translated into scores of other languages and became a bestseller in many other countries. So it just didn't seem to me that anti-Semitism was a very good explanatory variable for how we got from those days to today. There's one other problem with anti-Semitism that I thought about, or one other problem with, there are many problems with anti-Semitism, but I mean, we're talking about it in this overall argument, which is, I thought about this when Walt and Mearsheimer published first their paper and then their book. And I thought that it was all quite nasty. And when I read it, I thought this really just reeks of anti-Semitism. But they inoculated themselves right in the paper that preceded the book, and again in the book. But right at the beginning they said, we may be called anti-Semites, but far from it. Not only are we not anti-Semites, we are philo-Semites. And then people read what they wrote, and any number of critics said, you're anti-Semites. And they said, no, we're not. And the critics said, yes, you are. No, we're not. And at that point, it seemed to me that the argument goes nowhere. And I feel that it's very hard for me to prove that so-and-so is an anti-Semite, but it's not at all hard for me to prove that what someone is saying about Israel is false, unfair, unbalanced, unjust. And I'd rather keep the argument on that plane than to get myself embroiled in trying to prove what's in someone's heart or mind.
Thanks. We have time for one more question, and will you be signing books afterwards, or people could talk to you afterwards?
If people will buy books, I will sign them.
Okay. Well, that sounds good. This lady up here.
Hi, my name is Barbara Dello, and my question is, when you look at the conflict and you assign blame, or look at the blame, because you have to kind of identify the problems in order to work towards solutions, would you say the Islamic side has 100% of the blame and Israel has 0, or would you make it like 90-10, or how would you do that? In other words, are there things Israel can do to maybe work also towards solution?
Let me say two things in response to that. One is, in terms of, I think it's less important to assign blame than to think about how the conflict could be ended, and to have the only formulas that are convincing to me for ending the conflict are formulas that involve very substantial concessions on both sides. And I think there's no, and I don't have much sympathy for some in Israel who seem to take the position, well, we'll just have everything we want and somehow this problem will go away. I don't think that's at all reasonable. And in assigning blame, it becomes trickier. Since I'm not an Israeli, and I don't share the risks that Israelis are experiencing at this moment and that they live with every day, I try to impose on myself a rule of great modesty in taking positions on what Israel ought to do. But if I were an Israeli, I would be on the more soft line rather than hard line side of the spectrum. That is, among those who do accept that there should be a two-state solution, And I think that a lot of the settlement building is foolish and is a nuisance, and that in the end, if there is ever a settlement, which seems to me not at all certain, but if there is, it will have to involve dismantling of some settlements, consolidation, and so in that sense, I'm not in blanket accord with everything that's done by Israelis or that's done by Israel, but it also doesn't seem to me a very meaningful exercise to say, this one did that one thing wrong and that one did that thing wrong. There's a basic cause of this conflict, and that's not in 100 details. It's in sort of one big idea. And the basic cause of the conflict is that the Arabs initially would not accept the existence of any sovereign Jewish state in their midst, of any size and with any borders. And over the decades, even generations, some of them now do, including some of the Palestinians. But I think whereas there's a very clear majority in Israel for a settlement, for a two-state solution, for the creation of a Palestinian state as part of a peace agreement, among the Palestinians, there is not and never has been a consensus that says, okay, we'll go for two states as a permanent solution. We will accept that Israel is there forever and we're there forever and we'll live side by side in a productive relationship. There certainly are a substantial number of Palestinians who do want that and do believe that. But there's another substantial number who don't. The most recent poll was taken in May, sponsored by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, conducted by respected Palestinian poll organization, and it found that twice as many Palestinians agreed with the proposition that we want the conflict to go on until we have all of Palestine from the river to the sea, as chose the option that said we'd like a two-state solution so we can go on building our own and while our neighbors build their own. Now that poll result, I hasten to say, is actually worse numbers than have appeared in similar polls in other years. So sometimes it's been more 50-50, but even 50-50 isn't quite enough. There has to be a consensus on the Palestinian side. It doesn't have to be 100%, but it has to be consensus that they will go for permanent peace. Permanent peace also means policing their side of if there's a Palestinian state, then you can't allow it to be a base for attacks on neighboring states. And I think rather than look for blame in sort of day to day in every action on the diplomatic front or on the settlement building front or on the military front, the essential question is, who wants peace and who wants fighting? And on that question, it's pretty clear that the blame is today, as it has been since this conflict began, on one side.
Well, thank you. And with that, can I ask members of the audience to join me in thanking Joshua for a very illuminating talk? And he will be outside at the table if you want to buy books. And I think we should also have some sandwiches out there in the atrium. Thank you.